I was staring at my father's pale face when I heard the screaming outside, and that's when I realized the nightmare was about to get infinitely worse. My name is Yannick Crawford, and I had moved into Meadowbrook Estates in Charlotte, North Carolina about 8 months ago. It seemed like the perfect suburban neighborhood when I bought the place, manicured lawns, good schools nearby for when I eventually had kids, and a community pool that sparkled in the summer sun. What I didn't realize was that the Homeowners Association, led by a woman named Barbara Henderson, ran the place like a military dictatorship crossed with a maximum security prison. But that morning in March, none of the previous HOA drama mattered. My father, Richard Crawford, was visiting from Ohio when he collapsed in my living room. One moment we were drinking coffee and talking about his upcoming retirement, and the next he was clutching his chest and gasping for air. His face went from red to gray in seconds, and his eyes filled with panic as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 immediately, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The operator answered on the second ring, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. My father was 67 years old, had a history of heart problems, and was currently unresponsive on my floor. The operator told me an ambulance was being dispatched and that I should stay on the line. I knelt beside my father, checking his pulse like the operator instructed. It was there but weak and irregular. His breathing was shallow and ragged. I loosened his collar and tried to remember the CPR training I had taken years ago, praying I wouldn't need to use it. The operator kept me focused, asking questions about his symptoms and medical history, while I watched the color drain further from his face. "The ambulance should be there in approximately 4 minutes," the operator said. "They're coming from the station on Providence Road. Is your address clearly marked? Is there clear access to your home?" "Yes, everything's marked," I said, glancing at my father's chest to make sure it was still rising and falling. "The house number is on the mailbox and the front door. Please tell them to hurry." Those 4 minutes felt like 4 hours. I kept talking to my father even though he couldn't respond, telling him to hold on, that help was coming, that he was going to be fine. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer, and relief flooded through me. The ambulance was almost here. Everything was going to be okay. Then the sirens stopped. Not the gradual fade of a vehicle arriving at its destination, but an abrupt halt. They sounded close, but not close enough. They should have been right outside my house by now. "Something's wrong," I told the operator. "I can hear the sirens, but they stopped." "They're not here yet." The operator sounded confused. "Let me contact the ambulance. Hold on." I could hear her speaking to someone else, her voice professional but concerned. When she came back on the line, her tone had changed. "Sir, the paramedics are reporting that access to your street is blocked. There's a gate that's been closed and they cannot get through." My blood ran cold. The gate. The stupid decorative gate that Barbara Henderson had insisted the HOA install at the entrance to our cul-de-sac 3 weeks ago. It was supposed to be ornamental, something to make our little section of the neighborhood look more upscale. But Barbara had taken it upon herself to start closing it during certain hours, claiming it added security and property value. "The gate has a code," I said frantically. "It's 0427. Tell them 0427. More muffled conversation. Then the operator came back. "They're saying the code isn't working. The gate won't open." I looked down at my father. His lips were turning blue. "Tell them to ram it, break through it." "I don't care about property damage. My father is dying." "They're attempting to contact someone to open it," the operator said, "and they're discussing other options." Other options. My father was having a heart attack and they were discussing options. I made a decision in that split second. I'm going to open the gate manually. Stay with my father. I knew I couldn't actually stay with my father because I was the only one there, but I had to do something. I ran out my front door and sprinted down the street toward the gate, which was about 200 yards away at the entrance to our section of Meadowbrook Estates. I could see the ambulance through the decorative iron bars, lights still flashing, and I could see the paramedics trying to figure out how to get through. The gate was electronic, but it had a manual release mechanism for emergencies. The problem was that Barbara had installed a locked cover over the manual release last week because she said kids had been tampering with it. I didn't have the key. "Can you break the lock?" I shouted to the paramedics through the gate. "We're not authorized to damage HOA property without proper clearance," one of them called back. "We've called for bolt cutters, but my father is dying," I screamed. "He's in my house alone right now having a heart attack. Break the gate," a woman's voice cut through the chaos. "Absolutely not. You will not damage that gate." I spun around to see Barbara Henderson marching down the street toward me, her phone in her hand and her face twisted in indignation. She was 53 years old, always wore her blonde hair in the same tight bob, and treated the HOA bylaws like they were handed down from God himself. She was wearing a lavender tracksuit and pristine white tennis shoes that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Barbara, get out of my way," I said, turning back to the gate. "That gate cost the association $12,000, she said, positioning herself between me and the control box. "If you damage it, you will be personally liable for repairs, and my father is having a heart attack." I shouted in her face, "Move. Then they can go around to the main entrance," Barbara said, crossing her arms. "I don't have the key to the manual release with me, and I'm not authorizing anyone to break association property." The paramedic on the other side of the gate spoke up. "Madam, this is a medical emergency. We need access immediately." "And you can have access through the main entrance like everyone else," Barbara said primly. "The rules state that the gate remains closed from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. on weekdays unless—" I didn't let her finish. I shoved past her and grabbed a decorative rock from the landscaping beside the gate. Before she could react, I swung it at the lock covering the manual release. The lock shattered on the second hit, and I yanked the cover off and pulled the manual release lever. The gate began to slowly swing open, its motor whirring in protest. The paramedics didn't wait for it to fully open. They drove through as soon as the gap was wide enough, their ambulance scraping slightly against the gate post. Barbara was screaming behind me about lawsuits and property damage and calling the police, but I was already running back toward my house. The ambulance pulled up in front of my place just as I reached my driveway. The paramedics jumped out with their equipment, and I led them inside to where my father lay on the living room floor, his breathing even more shallow than before. "How long has he been unconscious?" the first paramedic asked, dropping to her knees beside my father and immediately checking his vitals. "He collapsed about 10 minutes ago," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Chest pain, difficulty breathing, then he passed out." The second paramedic was already setting up equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. They worked quickly, professionally, cutting open my father's shirt and attaching electrode pads to his chest. One of them started in Roman 4 while the other communicated with the hospital via radio. "We've got a weak pulse, respiration shallow and irregular, suspected myocardial infarction," the female paramedic said into her radio. "We're administering oxygen and preparing for transport." I stood there feeling completely useless as they worked on my father, saving his life right there on my beige carpet. They loaded him onto a stretcher within minutes, still working on him as they wheeled him toward the ambulance. I grabbed my keys and wallet, intending to follow them to the hospital. That's when I saw Barbara standing in my driveway, her phone still in her hand and a police car pulling up behind the ambulance. "That's him, officer," Barbara said, pointing at me. "He destroyed HOA property and threatened me." The officer, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, held up his hand. "Madam, I need you to step back. Sir, are you Yannick Crawford?" "Yes, and that's my father they're loading into the ambulance," I said. "I need to get to the hospital." The paramedics were already closing the ambulance doors. The female paramedic turned to me. "Carolina Medical Center. We're taking him straight to the cardiac unit. You can follow us." I nodded and moved toward my car, but Barbara stepped in front of me. "Officer, I insist you detain him. He vandalized association property and, madam, please step aside," the officer said, his tone firm. He turned to me. "Go ahead and follow the ambulance, Mr. Crawford. I'll need to get a statement from you later, but your father's health takes priority." I didn't wait for Barbara's response. I jumped in my car and followed the ambulance as it pulled away, lights flashing and sirens wailing. In my rearview mirror, I could see Barbara gesticulating wildly at the police officer, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The drive to Carolina Medical Center was a blur. I stayed close to the ambulance, running red lights under the protection of their emergency vehicle status. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if my father didn't make it? What if those crucial minutes wasted at the gate had made the difference between life and death? We arrived at the emergency entrance and the paramedics rushed my father inside. I parked haphazardly and ran after them, but a nurse stopped me at the entrance to the trauma bay. "Are you family?" "His son, Yannick Crawford. The doctors are with him now. I need you to go to the waiting area and someone will update you as soon as possible. I also need you to fill out some forms with his medical history and insurance information." I wanted to argue, to insist on being with my father, but I knew it wouldn't help. I went to the waiting area and took the clipboard of forms the registrar handed me. My hands were still shaking as I filled in my father's information: name, date of birth, social security number, medical history, current medications, insurance provider. The mundane administrative tasks felt surreal given that my father was potentially dying a few rooms away. An hour passed. Then two. I called my sister, Jennifer, who lived in California. She started crying when I told her what happened and said she was booking the next flight out. I called my father's partner, Helen, who he had been dating for the past 5 years. She lived in Ohio near my father and immediately said she was driving down. I was on my 3rd cup of terrible hospital coffee when a doctor finally approached me. He was young, maybe 40, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested a long shift. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Dr. Patel. Your father is stable." The relief that washed over me was so intense I had to sit down. "He's going to be okay. He had a significant myocardial infarction, a heart attack. We've performed an emergency angioplasty and placed 2 stents in his coronary arteries. He's in the cardiac ICU now and we're monitoring him closely. The next 24 to 48 hours are critical, but he's responding well to treatment. Can I see him?" "He's sedated right now, but you can visit briefly. Follow me." Dr. Patel led me through a maze of hallways to the cardiac ICU. My father looked small and frail in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and Roman IV poles. His face had more color than it did on my living room floor, but he still looked frighteningly vulnerable. I pulled up a chair beside his bed and took his hand carefully, mindful of the Roman IV line. "The paramedics reported there was a delay in reaching your home," Dr. Patel said quietly. "Can you tell me what happened?" I explained about the gate, about Barbara refusing to let them through, about the crucial minutes wasted. Dr. Patel's expression darkened. "Those minutes matter in cardiac emergencies," he said. "Every minute of delayed treatment increases the risk of permanent heart damage and death. Your father is very lucky." Lucky. My father was lucky because I had broken HOA property to save his life. I stayed with my father for about 30 minutes before a nurse gently suggested I go home and get some rest. Visiting hours in the ICU were limited, and my father would be sedated for several more hours anyway. I could come back in the morning. I drove home in a daze, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving me exhausted. It was almost 8 p.m. when I pulled into my driveway. There was an envelope taped to my front door. I pulled it down and opened it, already knowing what it would say. It was a notice from the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. I was being fined $5,000 for destruction of association property and being summoned to an emergency HOA board meeting in 3 days to discuss further disciplinary action, up to and including foreclosure proceedings on my home. I crumpled the notice in my fist and went inside. My living room still showed signs of the medical emergency. The carpet was disturbed where my father had fallen. There were medical supply wrappers the paramedics had left behind, and my father's coffee cup sat half full on the end table. I cleaned up mechanically, my mind elsewhere. The anger came later, after I had showered and tried unsuccessfully to sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day. Barbara Henderson had blocked an ambulance during a medical emergency. She had prioritized a decorative gate over a human life. My father could have died because of her stubborn adherence to HOA rules. At 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and started researching. I looked up North Carolina laws regarding emergency vehicle access. I looked up HOA regulations and their limitations. I looked up similar cases where HOAs had interfered with emergency services. What I found made me even angrier. It was illegal in North Carolina to block emergency vehicle access. HOAs could not enforce rules that contradicted state law or public safety requirements. Barbara Henderson hadn't just been unreasonable, she had potentially broken the law. The next morning, I went back to the hospital. My father was awake, though groggy and weak. His eyes filled with tears when he saw me, and I had to fight to keep my own emotions in check. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy from the breathing tube they had removed earlier. "The paramedics saved your life," I corrected him. "I just made sure they could get to you." "Jennifer called," he said. "She told me about the gate, about the HOA woman." I didn't want to stress him out by discussing it, but he pressed. I gave him the abbreviated version: Barbara blocking the ambulance, me breaking the lock, the notice of fine and meeting. My father's face flushed with anger and the heart monitor beeped faster. "Dad, calm down," I said quickly. "Don't worry about it. You need to focus on getting better." "That woman nearly killed me," he said. "You can't let her get away with this." A nurse came in to check on him, giving me a pointed look that said I needed to keep him calm. I promised my father we would deal with it later and spent the rest of the visit talking about neutral topics. Dr. Patel came by during his rounds and said my father's progress was encouraging. If he continued to improve, he might be moved out of the ICU in a couple of days. Jennifer arrived that afternoon, having caught a red-eye flight from San Diego. We took turns sitting with our father, and I filled her in on everything that had happened. My sister was a lawyer, though she specialized in corporate law rather than homeowner disputes. Still, she immediately started thinking about legal strategy. "You need to file a police report," she said as we sat in the hospital cafeteria. "What Barbara did wasn't just unreasonable, it was criminal." She obstructed emergency services. I have to go to this HOA meeting in 2 days, I said. They're threatening foreclosure. They can't foreclose on you for this, Jennifer said firmly. You were acting in a medical emergency. Any judge would throw it out, but you need to go on the offensive. File a report with the police. File a complaint with whatever government body oversees HOAs in North Carolina, and consider a civil lawsuit for endangerment. I just want my father to get better, I said tiredly. I know. But Dad's right, you can't let her get away with this. What if this happens to someone else? That thought had been nagging at me too. The decorative gate was still there. Barbara was still HOA president, and she clearly hadn't learned anything from nearly killing my father. What if another resident had a medical emergency? What if someone called the fire department and they couldn't get through? I spent the next day documenting everything. I got a copy of the paramedics' report, which explicitly stated the delay caused by the blocked gate. I took photos of the gate and the broken lock. I reviewed my HOA contract and bylaws, and I went to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department to file a formal report. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but cautious. "This is a complicated situation," Officer Ramirez said. "You did destroy property, even if it was for a good reason, and HOA disputes usually fall under civil rather than criminal jurisdiction." "She blocked an ambulance during a heart attack," I said. "That's not a civil dispute, that's obstruction of emergency services." Officer Ramirez made notes. "I'll document everything you've told me. The report will be forwarded to the district attorney's office. They'll decide if criminal charges are warranted. But I'll be honest with you, these things can take time." "My HOA meeting is tomorrow night," I said. "They're trying to fine me $5,000 and threatening foreclosure." "You should bring a lawyer to that meeting," Officer Ramirez advised, "and document everything they say. If they're retaliating against you for a legitimate emergency action, that could factor into any future proceedings." I left the police station feeling slightly better but still frustrated. The system moved slowly, and Barbara Henderson didn't seem like the type to back down. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center at Meadowbrook Estates. I arrived with Jennifer, who had put on her lawyer persona sharp blazer, no-nonsense expression, briefcase full of documents. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. About 20 neighbors had shown up, probably drawn by the drama. Barbara sat in the center of the table, flanked by the other board members, Tom Henderson, her husband and the treasurer, Denise Walsh, the secretary, and Craig Morrison, a member at large. They all looked uncomfortable except for Barbara, who sat with perfect posture and a satisfied expression. "This emergency meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board is now in session," Barbara said, banging a small gavel. "We are here to address the destruction of association property by Yannick Crawford and to determine appropriate disciplinary action." Jennifer stood up. "I'm Jennifer Crawford, Yannick's sister and legal counsel. Before we proceed, I need to state for the record that my client's actions were taken during a legitimate medical emergency involving our father, Richard Crawford, who suffered a severe heart attack on the morning of March 15th. The destruction of the lock on the manual gate release was necessary to allow emergency medical personnel to access the property and provide life-saving treatment." "That's irrelevant," Barbara said. "The rules clearly state that the gate must remain closed during designated hours and that any damage to association property is the responsibility of the homeowner." "It's absolutely relevant," Jennifer countered. "North Carolina law, specifically Statute 14-286.1, prohibits interference with emergency medical services. Your refusal to open the gate and your prevention of emergency personnel from accessing my client's property violated state law." A murmur went through the audience. Several neighbors were nodding. Barbara's face tightened. "I did not prevent anyone from accessing anything. The ambulance could have used the main entrance." The main entrance that would have added approximately 6 minutes to their response time, Jennifer said, pulling out documents. "I have the paramedics' report here which states that the delay caused by the blocked gate significantly impacted their ability to provide timely medical care. Every minute matters in cardiac emergencies. Your actions directly endangered a human life." Tom Henderson leaned over and whispered something to Barbara. She waved him off impatiently. "The gate is there for security purposes. Everyone in the community benefits from controlled access." Mr. Crawford knew about the gate and its operating hours. If he had a guest with medical issues, he should have made alternative arrangements. I stood up, unable to stay silent any longer. Alternative arrangements. My father was visiting. He had a heart attack. That's not something you plan for or schedule around HOA gate hours. Nevertheless, Barbara continued, the damage to association property occurred and must be addressed. The cost to repair the lock and gate mechanism is estimated at $700. Additionally, Mr. Crawford's aggressive behavior toward me and disregard for association rules warrants additional penalties. The board proposes a fine of $5,000 and a suspension of Mr. Crawford's voting rights and access to community amenities for 1 year. Several people in the audience gasped. Craig Morrison, the board member at large, looked uncomfortable. "Barbara, don't you think that's a bit excessive given the circumstances?" "The rules apply to everyone equally," Barbara said coldly. "We cannot make exceptions or chaos will ensue." Jennifer stood again. "This isn't about rules, Mrs. Henderson. This is retaliation. My client acted to save his father's life and you're attempting to punish him for it. That's not only morally reprehensible, it's legally actionable. Be aware that we've filed a police report regarding your obstruction of emergency services, and we're prepared to file a civil lawsuit for endangerment if this board proceeds with these punitive measures." The room erupted in conversation. Neighbors were talking among themselves, some of them clearly on my side. I saw Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, shaking her head disapprovingly at Barbara. Barbara banged her gavel. "Order! We will have order. The board has made its recommendation. We will now vote on the proposed fine and penalties. All in favor?" Barbara raised her hand immediately. Tom Henderson reluctantly raised his as well, clearly uncomfortable. Denise Walsh looked at Barbara, then at the audience, then kept her hand down. Craig Morrison shook his head. "I vote no. This is wrong." "The motion passes 2-2, Barbara announced. "As board president, I cast the deciding vote in favor. Mr. Crawford, you are hereby fined $5,000, payable within 30 days, and your HOA privileges are suspended for 1 year. If you fail to pay, we will initiate foreclosure proceedings." The room exploded with angry voices. Several neighbors stood up to shout at Barbara. Mrs. Patterson called her heartless. A man I recognized from down the street said he was going to push for her removal from the board. Jennifer was already on her phone, presumably calling other lawyers or researching legal precedents. I just sat there, numb with disbelief. My father was in the hospital recovering from a heart attack that had been made worse by this woman's actions, and she was fining me $5,000 for saving his life. "This meeting is adjourned," Barbara said, gathering her papers. She stood up and walked out of the room with her head held high, ignoring the angry residents trying to speak to her. Craig Morrison approached me after Barbara left. "Yannick, I'm sorry. I voted against it, and I'm going to start working on getting Barbara removed from the board. What she did was unconscionable." "Thank you," I said, though the words felt hollow. "There are procedures for removing board members," Craig continued. "We need 20% of homeowners to sign a petition calling for a vote, then a simple majority to remove her. I think we can get the signatures easily after tonight." Several other neighbors came up to express their support and offer to sign any petition. Mrs. Patterson gave me a hug and pressed a check for $200 into my hand. "For the legal fees, dear. That woman has been a tyrant for too long." Jennifer and I left the community center and walked back to my house. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot. Barbara Henderson just made a huge mistake by pushing forward with those fines and penalties despite the circumstances. It's going to look terrible if this goes to court. I can't afford a prolonged legal battle," I said, "and I don't want to spend the next year fighting with my HOA while my father recovers." "You might not have to," Jennifer said. "Let me make some calls. I have colleagues who specialize in HOA disputes. And given the circumstances, the medical emergency, the police report, the clear violation of state law, I think we can resolve this quickly." Over the next few days, things moved fast. The story of my father's heart attack and Barbara's blocking of the ambulance spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. Craig Morrison collected over 100 signatures on his petition to remove Barbara from the board, far more than the 20% required. Several local news stations picked up the story after Jennifer reached out to them, and suddenly reporters were calling me for interviews. I declined most of the media requests, not wanting to turn my father's medical crisis into a spectacle. But Jennifer gave a carefully worded statement to one local news outlet, and the story aired on the evening news. The headline was, "HOA President Blocks Ambulance During Heart Attack." It painted Barbara in an extremely unfavorable light. My father was moved out of the ICU after 4 days. He was weak and facing a long recovery, but Dr. Patel was optimistic about his prognosis. Helen arrived from Ohio and rarely left his side. I visited every day, updating him on the HOA situation despite his doctor's recommendations to avoid stress. "Let Jennifer handle it," he told me. "She's a pit bull when she gets going. Barbara Henderson picked the wrong family to mess with." Jennifer had indeed gone into full legal attack mode. She had partnered with a local attorney named Marcus Wright who specialized in HOA disputes and had an impressive track record. Together, they drafted a comprehensive response to the HOA's fines and penalties, along with a counterclaim for damages, emotional distress, and violation of state law. But the real pressure came from the community itself. Within a week of the disastrous HOA meeting, over 60% of Meadowbrook Estates residents had signed the petition to remove Barbara from the board. A special meeting was called for the following week to vote on her removal. Barbara didn't go quietly. She sent a mass email to all residents defending her actions and claiming she was being persecuted for enforcing the rules fairly. She argued that the gate policy existed for everyone's safety, and that she had offered a reasonable alternative by suggesting the ambulance use the main entrance. She portrayed herself as a victim of a coordinated attack by people who wanted to flout community standards. The email backfired spectacularly. Residents who had been on the fence about the issue were outraged by her tone-deaf defense. Even Tom Henderson, her own husband, privately approached Craig Morrison and said he would not stand in the way of her removal. The special meeting had the highest turnout in Meadowbrook Estates history. Over 200 residents packed into the community center, far exceeding its normal capacity. Additional chairs had to be brought in, and people stood along the walls. Local news cameras were set up in the back, having been granted permission to film. Barbara sat at the board table looking defiant. Tom Henderson sat beside her but wouldn't meet her eyes. Denise Walsh and Craig Morrison sat on her other side, both looking relieved that this would soon be over. Craig Morrison, as the member-at-large, chaired the meeting since Barbara's position was what was being contested. This special meeting has been called pursuant to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws, Section 7, Subsection 3, which allows for the removal of board members by majority vote of the homeowners. The petition has been validated with signatures from 62% of homeowners. We will now hear statements for and against the removal of Barbara Henderson as HOA president, followed by a vote. Several residents spoke in favor of removal. Mrs. Patterson gave an impassioned speech about how Barbara had created a culture of fear and intimidation. A man named David spoke about receiving frivolous fines for minor violations, while Barbara's own property violated several rules. Another woman talked about how Barbara had blocked her attempt to install a wheelchair ramp for her disabled son, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. Then I spoke. I kept it factual and unemotional, describing exactly what had happened the day my father had his heart attack. I explained the delay caused by the gate, the paramedics' inability to access my property, and Barbara's refusal to help. I read excerpts from the paramedics' report and Dr. Patel's statement about how delays in cardiac care increase mortality and permanent damage. My father survived, I concluded. He's still in the hospital, but he's going to recover. But he almost didn't, and the next person might not be so lucky. Barbara Henderson's actions that day weren't just unreasonable or unsympathetic, they were dangerous and possibly criminal. Someone who prioritizes a decorative gate over a human life has no business leading this community. The room was silent when I finished. Even Barbara looked shaken, though she quickly composed herself. When it came time for her to defend herself, Barbara stood and gave essentially the same speech as her email. She talked about property values and community standards and the importance of rules. She claimed she had been acting in everyone's best interests and that she was being scapegoated for doing her job. If we start making exceptions to the rules, she said, then what's the point of having rules at all? Today, it's a medical emergency. Tomorrow someone will claim they need to violate the landscaping standards for an emergency. Then someone else will claim they need to paint their house a non-approved color for an emergency. Where does it end? The false equivalency was staggering. Several people booed. Craig Morrison had to call for order. The vote was taken by secret ballot to ensure fairness. Residents lined up to cast their votes in a cardboard box, monitored by an independent third party Craig had hired. It took over an hour to collect all the ballots. While the votes were being counted, I stepped outside for air. Jennifer joined me along with Marcus Wright, the HOA attorney. However this vote goes, Marcus said, you have a strong case. Barbara's actions violated multiple laws and HOA best practices. Even if she somehow survives this vote, she's facing potential criminal charges and civil liability. I just want this to be over, I said. It will be soon, Jennifer assured me, one way or another. We were called back inside after 30 minutes. Craig Morrison stood at the front table with the vote tally in his hand. The room fell silent. The votes have been counted and verified, Craig announced. Of the 207 ballots cast, 183 voted in favor of removing Barbara Henderson as HOA president. 24 voted against removal. The motion passes by an overwhelming majority. Barbara Henderson is hereby removed as president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Barbara's face went white, then red. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "This is a witch hunt. You're all going to regret this when property values plummet and this neighborhood turns into a slum." She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the community center, nearly running over a news cameraman in her haste. Tom Henderson followed her, apologizing quietly to people as he passed. Craig Morrison restored order and announced that an emergency election for a new board president would be held within 2 weeks. In the meantime, he would serve as acting president. His first order of business was to motion for the immediate rescinding of all fines and penalties levied against me. The motion passed unanimously. The crowd dispersed in a celebratory mood. Neighbors congratulated me and wished my father a speedy recovery. Mrs. Patterson hugged me again and said justice had been served. Even people I barely knew came up to shake my hand and say they were glad the nightmare was over, but it wasn't quite over yet. 2 days after Barbara's removal, I received a call from Officer Ramirez at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. "Mr. Crawford, I wanted to update you on your case. The district attorney's office has reviewed your report and the supporting evidence. They've decided to file charges against Barbara Henderson for obstruction of emergency services, a misdemeanor under North Carolina law. She's being charged with 1 count of obstructing medical assistance." "What does that mean?" I asked. "She'll be formally arrested and arraigned," Officer Ramirez explained. "Given that it's a misdemeanor and she has no criminal record, she'll likely be released on her own recognizance. The maximum penalty is 60 days in jail and a $1,000 fine, but first-time offenders usually get probation and community service. Still, it'll be on her record." I thanked him for the update and immediately called Jennifer to tell her. She was pleased but not surprised. "Good. She deserves at least that much, and it strengthens our civil case significantly. A criminal conviction, even for a misdemeanor, demonstrates that her actions were not just unreasonable but illegal." The news of Barbara's impending arrest spread quickly through Meadowbrook Estates. The local news picked it up again, running a follow-up story about the HOA president who had been removed and was now facing criminal charges. Barbara's attempt to portray herself as a victim was completely undermined. Marcus Wright, the HOA attorney, reached out to Barbara's lawyer to discuss settling the civil matter. "We were seeking compensation for my father's medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. We were also demanding that the HOA implement new policies to prevent similar incidents in the future, including the permanent removal of the decorative gate or installing a system that automatically opened for emergency vehicles." Barbara initially refused to negotiate, insisting she had done nothing wrong. But as the criminal charges proceeded and more details emerged, her position became increasingly untenable. The paramedics gave statements to the district attorney's office describing Barbara's obstruction in damning detail. One of them said, "In my 15 years as a paramedic, I've never encountered someone who deliberately prevented us from reaching a patient. It was unconscionable. My father was released from the hospital after 2 weeks. He moved into my guest room for his recovery, with Helen staying to help care for him. He was on strict orders to rest, take his medications, attend cardiac rehabilitation, and avoid stress. Watching him shuffle slowly around my house, still pale and weak, reinforced how close I had come to losing him. That woman almost took you from us," Jennifer said one evening as we sat in my living room while Dad napped. "I know you want to put this behind you, but she needs to be held accountable. "I know," I said. "I'm not backing down. I just wish it didn't have to take so much time and energy." "Justice usually does," Jennifer said, "but it's worth it." The criminal case moved forward. Barbara was formally arrested and arraigned in early April. She pleaded not guilty and was released on her own recognizance, just as Officer Ramirez had predicted. Her lawyer argued that she had been acting in her capacity as HOA president to enforce community rules and had no criminal intent. The prosecutor countered that intent was irrelevant. She had obstructed emergency services, full stop, and someone had nearly died as a result. The trial was set for late May. In the meantime, the civil case progressed. Marcus Wright was methodical in building our case, collecting medical records, expert testimony about cardiac care, and documentation of Barbara's pattern of unreasonable behavior as HOA president. He also worked with the new HOA board, which had elected Craig Morrison as president, to implement safety reforms. The decorative gate was removed entirely in mid-April, replaced with a simple aesthetic entrance marker that didn't impede access. The new board also passed policies requiring that no barriers ever be installed that could impede emergency vehicle access, and they distributed information to all residents about proper emergency procedures. My father's recovery continued slowly but steadily. He attended cardiac rehab 3 times a week, and his color gradually returned. Dr. Patel was pleased with his progress. "You're a lucky man, Richard," he told my father during a follow-up appointment. "The damage to your heart was significant, but thanks to the quick intervention, it could have been much worse." "Thanks to my son," Dad corrected him. "If he hadn't broken that gate, I'd be dead." The criminal trial took place on May 28th. Jennifer flew back from California, and Helen and I accompanied my father to the courthouse. He was still weak and using a cane, but he insisted on being there. The trial lasted 2 days. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Barbara Henderson had prevented emergency medical personnel from accessing a patient during a life-threatening emergency in violation of North Carolina law. They called the paramedics as witnesses, who testified about the delay and Barbara's refusal to help. They called Dr. Patel, who testified about the importance of rapid response in cardiac emergencies and how the delay had worsened my father's condition and prognosis. I testified about what happened that day, reliving the panic and fear as I watched my father collapse and then the nightmare of the blocked ambulance. The prosecutor asked me to describe Barbara's demeanor when I tried to open the gate. "She was angry," I said. "Not concerned about my father or the emergency, just angry that I was going to damage HOA property. She said the ambulance should go around to the main entrance. She didn't care that my father was dying." Barbara's lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer trying to fulfill her duties, but the facts were too damning. Barbara took the stand in her own defense and made things worse. She remained defensive and unapologetic, insisting she had followed proper procedures and that the ambulance crew had overreacted. "There was an alternative route available," she testified. "I was simply enforcing the community's access policies. I can't be held responsible for someone's medical emergency." The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. "Mrs. Henderson, are you aware that North Carolina law requires you to facilitate emergency vehicle access?" "I'm not familiar with every statute," Barbara said stiffly. "Are you aware that your refusal to open the gate resulted in a delay of approximately 7 minutes in Mr. Crawford reaching his patient?" I offered an alternative. An alternative that would have taken longer and potentially cost Richard Crawford his life. Barbara's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Barbara showed no emotion as the verdict was read, sitting ramrod straight with her hands folded in her lap. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, Barbara's lawyer approached Marcus right about settling the civil case. Barbara was now facing a criminal record and apparently wanted to avoid a prolonged civil trial that would further expose her actions. The settlement negotiations took place over several days. Barbara's initial offer was laughably low. She offered to pay the $700 for the gate repair and drop any remaining claims against me, as if that was some kind of concession. Marcus rejected it immediately and countered with our full demand: $50,000 to cover medical expenses, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. We eventually settled for $35,000. It wasn't about the money for me. My father's insurance had covered most of his medical bills. But I wanted Barbara to face real consequences, and I wanted to establish a precedent that HOAs couldn't endanger residents with impunity. The settlement also included a written apology from Barbara, which her lawyer clearly had to force her to sign. The apology was perfunctory and legalistic, but it was something. I, Barbara Henderson, acknowledge that my actions on March 15th delayed emergency medical care for Richard Crawford. I regret any harm that resulted from my decisions that day. Not exactly heartfelt, but it was an admission of wrongdoing from someone who had refused to admit fault at every step. Barbara's sentencing hearing took place in mid-June. My father was well enough by then to attend, though he still tired easily. The judge heard statements from both sides before pronouncing sentence. "Mrs. Henderson," the judge said, "you were in a position of authority in your community, and you abused that authority in a way that endangered a human life. You prioritized rules and property over someone's health and safety. While I recognize you had no criminal intent to harm Mr. Crawford, your actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life that cannot be excused." The judge sentenced Barbara to 90 days in jail, suspended upon completion of 200 hours of community service and 2 years of probation. She was also fined $1,000 and ordered to complete a course on emergency response and public safety. If she violated the terms of her probation, she would serve the full 90 days. Barbara accepted the sentence with the same stiff-backed composure she had maintained throughout. Tom Henderson sat in the back of the courtroom, looking defeated. I later heard they separated a few months after all of this, though I don't know if Barbara's legal troubles were the cause or just the final straw. Life gradually returned to normal after that. My father completed his cardiac rehab and returned to Ohio in August, much healthier and with a new appreciation for life. He retired as planned and spent his time traveling with Helen and spoiling Jennifer's kids. Dr. Patel continued to monitor him, and his prognosis remained good. Meadowbrook Estates underwent a transformation under Craig Morrison's leadership. The new HOA board focused on actual community building rather than enforcing petty rules. They organized neighborhood barbecues and a community garden. They revised the bylaws to be less draconian and more focused on genuine quality of life issues. Property values actually increased, disproving Barbara's dire predictions. I occasionally saw Barbara around town. She always looked away quickly when our paths crossed, refusing to make eye contact. She had moved to a different neighborhood after everything that happened, unable to face her former neighbors. I heard through the grapevine that she completed her community service at a local hospital, which struck me as appropriately ironic. The whole ordeal taught me several things. First, Never underestimate the power of a community to self-correct when faced with genuine injustice. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates had rallied around me and my father when it mattered, despite years of intimidation from Barbara. Second, some battles are worth fighting even when they are exhausting and expensive. If I had just paid the fine and accepted the HOA's penalties, Barbara would have continued her reign of petty tyranny and potentially endangered other lives. And third, family is everything. Jennifer dropped everything to fly across the country and fight for us. My father survived in part because of his own resilience, but also because of the network of love and support surrounding him. Jennifer returned to California eventually but visited more often. We had grown closer through the crisis, reminded that life is fragile and family matters more than anything. My father called me every Sunday without fail to check in and tell me he loved me. Helen became an unofficial member of our family, and we all celebrated when Dad finally proposed to her the following Christmas. The story made me somewhat infamous in Charlotte for a while. People recognized me from the news coverage and would ask if I was the guy who fought the HOA. Some of them shared their own HOA horror stories. I heard tales of fines for parking in your own driveway, bans on certain types of plants, restrictions on holiday decorations, and 1,000 other petty tyrannies. It made me realize how lucky I was to live in Meadowbrook Estates after the reforms, where the HOA actually served the community rather than ruling over it. I never forgot those terrible moments when my father collapsed, or the sound of the ambulance sirens stopping short of my house, or the sight of Barbara Henderson standing in front of that gate telling paramedics they couldn't come through. Those memories stayed with me, sharp and clear, a reminder of how quickly everything can change and how crucial it is to fight for what's right even when it's difficult. Sometimes I drive past the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates and see the simple stone marker that replaced the decorative gate. There's a small plaque on it now, installed by Craig Morrison and the new board. It reads, "Meadowbrook Estates, a community that cares. Emergency services always welcome." It's a small thing, but it represents something important. It represents a community that learned from its mistakes, that chose people over property, and that refused to let authority go unchecked. It represents the idea that rules should serve humans, not the other way around. My father fully recovered, defying the odds and his doctor's initial concerns. He often jokes that he's too stubborn to die, especially when there's a petty HOA president involved. He tells the story at family gatherings, embellishing it slightly more each time, until it becomes a tale of epic proportions where I single-handedly destroyed the gate with my bare hands while Barbara Henderson fled in terror. I let him tell it however he wants. He's earned that right. The experience changed me in subtle ways. I became more involved in community affairs, joining the HOA board myself after Craig Morrison stepped down to spend more time with his grandchildren. I made sure we maintained the reforms and continued to prioritize safety and common sense over rigid rule enforcement. I also became an advocate for HOA reform at the state level, working with a group trying to pass legislation limiting HOA powers and protecting homeowners' rights. It's not glamorous work, and change comes slowly. But every time I hear about another HOA overreach, another family facing absurd fines or restrictions, another situation where bureaucracy threatens to overshadow humanity, I remember my father's pale face and Barbara Henderson's crossed arms, and the ambulance stopped at the gate. And I keep fighting, because in the end, that's what matters. Not property values or aesthetic standards or perfect lawns, but people. Communities exist to serve the humans who live in them, not to control them. Rules should protect and enhance our lives, not endanger them. And when someone in authority forgets that fundamental truth, it's up to the rest of us to remind them. My father survived. The system, creaky and imperfect as it is, eventually delivered something resembling justice. Barbara Henderson faced consequences for her actions. Meadowbrook Estates became a better place to live. These are good outcomes, victories worth celebrating. But I also know how easily it could have gone differently. If I had been less assertive, if the neighbors had been less supportive, if the media hadn't picked up the story, if the district attorney had decided not to prosecute, any of those factors could have tipped the scales. My father might have died. Barbara might have continued her reign. The gate might still be there, closed and locked, waiting to block the next ambulance. That knowledge keeps me vigilant. It reminds me that justice isn't automatic, that communities don't fix themselves, and that standing up to petty tyrants is always necessary even when it's uncomfortable. It reminds me that every victory is temporary, and that the work of building a good community is never really done, so I keep working. I serve on the HOA board. I advocate for reform. I tell my story when it might help someone else facing similar challenges. I make sure that newcomers to Meadowbrook Estates know its history, both the dark chapter under Barbara Henderson and the Renaissance that followed. I help maintain the policies that prevent such abuses from happening again. And every Sunday when my father calls, I'm reminded of why it all matters. His voice is strong now, fully recovered, filled with life and plans and stories. He talks about his travels with Helen, about Jennifer's kids, about his garden and his book club, and the thousand small joys of a life almost cut short but ultimately preserved. "Love you, son," he always says before hanging up. "Love you too, Dad," I always reply. And in those moments, I know that breaking that gate was the easiest decision I ever made. Some rules deserve to be broken. Some fights are worth fighting. Some things matter more than property values and perfect lawns and decorative gates. Life matters. Family matters. Doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, even when petty tyrants stand in your way. That's the real lesson of my battle with the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. Not that I won, but that winning was possible. Not that Barbara Henderson was defeated, but that she could be defeated. Not that justice prevailed, but that justice can prevail when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. The story of that day has become part of Meadowbrook Estates lore now, passed down to new residents as a cautionary tale and a point of pride. The neighborhood that stood up to tyranny. The community that chose humanity over bureaucracy. The place where a son fought for his father's life and neighbors rallied to support him. It's a good story. I'm proud to be part of it, but I'm even prouder of what came after the reforms, the changed culture, the community we built from the ashes of Barbara Henderson's petty empire. That's the legacy that matters, the real victory that makes all the struggle worthwhile. Meadowbrook Estates is a better place now. My father is alive and healthy. Barbara Henderson learned, however reluctantly, that actions have consequences. The system, flawed as it is, bent toward justice. These are the outcomes I fought for, and they were worth every moment of stress and conflict. And if it happens again, if some future HOA president forgets these lessons and starts prioritizing rules over people, I'll fight again. Because that's what you do when you love your community and your family and the basic principle that humans matter more than regulations. You stand up. You speak out. You break the gate if you have to. And you trust that justice, though slow and imperfect, will eventually prevail. That's my story. That's what happened when my HOA blocked an ambulance during my father's heart attack. It's a story about crisis and conflict, about bureaucracy and humanity, about tyranny and resistance. But most of all, it's a story about choosing what matters. And in the end, people matter. Always have. Always will. Everything else is just details.